Hello everyone, my name's Daniel Rizzo Lopez, and I am back once more, but this time talking about the three main concepts of AP World History. So a little disclaimer before this video starts. In order to find the definitions, I had to synthesize from a whole bunch of sources, which are listed at the end of this PowerPoint, but essentially these definitions are up for debate, but these are the definitions that I somewhat think that the concepts follow. So for the main concepts, first we have cultural exchanges, or rather cultural exchange, is when two or more different cultures interact with each other. This usually results in a creation of mutual friendship or relationship in which both sides are inclined to learn from each other. Note that the wording is slightly for cross-cultural exchanges is going to get slightly confusing to distinguish, just because there's differences in the wording and then the definitions. Cross-regional exchange, so focusing on regions instead of cultures, so when two or more regions or areas interact with each other, which causes them to be enriched by what is observed or gained. So, of course, this little image in the bottom right, and this second bullet point, the regions can range from entire continents to small areas on these continents. So like we can have the entire Canada and the US be like two different regions, because there is still differences between them. And for the two or more different cultures, it could be from within the culture but in a different region, or two different cultures from across the world. Cross-cultural exchanges is similar to cultural exchange, but the scope of what is exchange is broadened. Two or more cultures interact in various ways, such as trading, teaching, or visiting. The slight difference is that cross-cultural exchange looks at the differences between the cultures. Yeah. So this I may get a lot of blame for this or a lot of slack for this, but essentially they're connected in this one way that essentially if you're doing one, you're doing all three at once. Even though they do have their own differences, is just because of how broad these definitions are and how broad these concepts can be, essentially there's a chance of you partaking in all three of them at once. And of course the magic of all this is sometimes the magic is that they have the shared goal of learning or trading information between participants in a positive note. Because I'm trying to be positive, even though history has shown us it's not very positive. While my research, it was difficult to find a concrete definition, so that's why I had to synthesize these definitions for these concepts, because essentially they are very similar, but the only difference is the conditions in which that they can occur. But even so, like sometimes there may be multiple conditions met when you're doing this type of stuff. And so this idea brings up the thought of a chain, or even like some type of braid, because essentially these three concepts just go into the braid to form one. So you may be wondering why there's not a separate top 5 for each. Well, I somewhat found a loophole, and this comes from my research too, but essentially all the top 5 most impactful exchanges, they all somewhat cover all three concepts at once. So that's why essentially just think of this as for top 5, I'm going one by one and I will be explaining each. So number 5, we have the Columbian Exchange. So this started in 1492, in which Columbus made it to the Caribbeans, which opened up the world to new things, at least the European side. So prior to this, Europe and the Eastern Hemisphere did not have cacao, tobacco, and other plants and crops, such as like maize, which is like a type of corn. And because of this discovery, I put it in quotations because it's always been there, but what is it? The Europeans never really adventured that far. So some can argue because Columbus did some horrible stuff to the natives, but there was times where like they peacefully traded and they most likely learned how to handle the crops and that were foreign to themselves. Columbus also did show them weapons such as swords and the material of metal. And this was also the start of the Europeans' first glance at racism. Because if you go off the idea that essentially Columbus saw himself as superior as these natives, which sort of started rooting the race, showing more of the racism, and which is still relevant to this day. So here's a little diagram showing what essentially was carried over from Europe to the Caribbeans, and what was carried over from Caribbeans to the rest of to Europe. So this is just mostly foods, and then there was some diseases and cattle brought over. So essentially the cross-regional exchange right here is of course the Eastern Hemisphere area, Europe, Africa, and Asia, exchanging with, of course, the Caribbeans, or of course part of the Western Hemisphere. Of course, the cultural exchanges and the cross-cultural was, of course, the white Englishmen with the natives of the Caribbeans. Next up, we got the slave trade. So, started out in the 15th century, and the slave trade continues throughout history. So, essentially, this was branched off from the Columbian Exchange, because essentially the rest of Europe started colonizing the Americas. And so the Portuguese took this time to also explore the coast of West Africa, in which they captured some Africans for slaves, though the need for slaves started ramping up around the 1650s, because the Portuguese, they developed plantations in Brazil, and so there was more demand for slaves in order to man these plantations. And so and also a European country saw the effect of this, and so they decided to hop on, and so this started like something called the Atlantic slave trade. So the Atlantic slave trade is this little triangle down here. Essentially, Europe would essentially send over manufactured goods to Africa, and from Africa they would take slaves to America. Of course, up here they sort of took them everywhere, but this was the transatlantics. What was it called? The Atlantic slave trade. Sorry. And from the Americas they would bring over raw materials to Europe. And of course, for the slave trade, when they took over slaves, you can see just how many slaves they took in based on the thickness of the lines, but a lot of it went to Brazil. The bulk of it went to the Brazil and South American area. So one of the cross-cultural exchanges results was Creole, in which essentially the mixing of black people and white people, which created Creole, and then it also helped spread Catholic or the Christianity. Because and then sometimes there was even a mixture, because the Africans' religions had like answers that Catholics could not provide an answer to an issue for. So you can see some of the effects of just working now and just learning from each other and looking at their differences right here. Of course, next up we have number three, which is the spread of Buddhism. So first beginning in the 6th century BCE, and it continued for quite a while. So essentially Buddhism, the Buddha instructed his monks to travel and spread the teachings of Buddhism to everyone. And these teachings are, of course, the way to enlightenment and just being happy with your life. So one of the emperors, his name was Asoka the Great, in which he ruled the entire Indian subcontinent. And so he encouraged and inspired many people to follow the Buddhist beliefs. And also the Buddha also established the need to read the teachings of a religion before blindly following it. So this was different from Christianity, in which to the previous parts, the slave trade and the Columbian exchange, they both forced Christianity onto the people. While Asoka the Great and the Buddha, they essentially didn't want to force them. They just essentially showed them what it was and just taught them before having them inscribed. So here we can see just how far Buddhism spread, and these lines of course represent how probably different people that took it or during different times. Buddhism isn't really a religion, it's rather a mentality, which is also makes it easier to mix with other religions or fit into other cultures, which is the great part of it. While Asoka the Great ruled and the Buddha taught, they both sent monks or missionaries to teach people about Buddhism, which explains this man to the right, or this map. Sorry for the spelling error, but that's supposed to be a P, but this map. And of course you can see the different regions, from starting in the Indian subcontinent, reaching all the way to Japan, reaching over here, I'm assuming there's like German area, and all the way up to Russia. The spread of Christianity under Constantine is another one. So this started during the 4th century Common Era, and it followed all of Constantine's rule and beyond. So essentially Constantine adopted Christianity as a basis for his empire and made it the choice of religion. So Constantine decriminalized it, he made it essentially legal, and he also added tolerance for all religions. So there's one note here that his version of Christianity was different because it was a mixture of different beliefs in order to unite his empire. And of course it was more, he also had like some sort of hateful beliefs in there too that I won't go into. So the spread of Christianity, so at the decline of Constantine's empire, Christianity began to like build up in the outer areas of the empire. So missionaries would go around, and this is where Catholics started popping up, because Catholic was the Latin word for universal. This of course spiraled up to the creation of the Bible, making it a universal thing, because at that point there was no religious book, they were just going off the Gospels. And of course Christianity would not have been able to spread if it wasn't for Paul, because around that time Christianity was viewed as strictly for Jews, and so he helped cementing it in by traveling to Rome. So here we can see the different paths of the different missionaries, the Gospels, and of course just how Christianity was all over the area. Silk Road. So Silk Road is one of the biggest ones that popped up from my research. So essentially Silk Road was let me use a diagram. Silk Road was essentially a way to was a trade route that China used to connect themselves with Europe, in which they were able to trade goods, but also instead of not just trading goods, they were able to mix ideas. So this began in the 2nd century BCE, and it continued to the 18th century Common Era. Alright, so of course the Silk Road, all these events happened during written history, written accords, but of course they also lasted quite a while. So Silk Road, of course, network of trade paths which connected the West, Europe, to the East, China. And so, though the Silk Road is intended for physical goods trading, also cultivated a lot of cultural exchanges, cross-regional exchanges. So Buddhism was a prominent mentality rather than religion on the trade routes, because of course there was the traveling monks. Asoka the Great sent, and of course the Buddha sent. And same thing with Christianity. There was missionaries also going through this trade route. So of course people, they mingled, they got to learn more about each other, more about the outside worlds, because especially for China's case, because it was isolated by a mountain range. So trade routes helped get materials from China to Europe and vice versa. Art was also exchanged on the road, and even sciences from the respective cultures. In the Silk Road, there was also, of course, the introductions of a whole bunch of religions, or these three religions: Zoroastrianism, and then Manichaeism, which is a mixture of Zoroastrianism. Not going to go into deep about that, and Islam too. Some of the goods that China was sending over was gunpowder, silk, and then some techniques was paper making and printing, which made it to the West. Since these went over the West, it helped speed up the advancement of civilizations in the Western side, because China was able to essentially be undisrupted and just cultivate even better, faster than the rest of the world, because there wasn't fears of attacks. And yeah, so this concludes the list of the top 5. And of course, before I end this off, cross-regional, of course you had China, which is over here on quite a far away. Then you got India, then you got some parts of Persia, Arabia, Europe, Egypt, Somalia. So why didn't I do a top 5 for each, like I said earlier? Because essentially, you can't distinguish one of these concepts, because they all happen at the same time. So it would be hard to just break it apart. So that's why I take this list as essentially a united list for all 3 concepts. And Mr. Cruz, please don't kill me. I apologize if I outsmarted you in this, but here's some of my sources. And of course, I had to go through, and there was a mention of cultural appropriation and cultural diffusion, which also lies under the cultural exchange and cross-cultural exchange. So I had to go through, synthesize, read a whole bunch of these sources, pick out information that makes sense. And of course, I hope this helps people understand, or at least try to grasp, what this confusion of a mess is about these 3 concepts. Alright, and see you guys later.